Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to talk about this paper. This is joint work with Laura Wary and Diana Green Foster, and I'm Sarah Miller from the University of Michigan Ross School of Business. And in this project, we're looking at the economic and financial consequences of being denied an abortion. And our motivation for this comes in part from the fact then that often those seeking abortion cite not being financially prepared as a reason for wanting to end the pregnancy. An unintended pregnancy can result in lost earnings, it might result in higher household or family expenses, and these in turn can have long-term consequences for a woman's ability to keep her head above water financially. So in this project, we're asking, what is the impact of being denied an abortion on a woman's financial situation and financial well-being? Our data come from the Turnaway study, which worked with 30 different abortion providers in 21 different states to recruit women seeking abortions. These abortion providers had different gestational age cutoffs beyond which they would not provide an abortion. So the study recruited two groups of women that we're going to talk about today. The first had gestational ages close to this cutoff, but a bit above the cutoff, up to 3 weeks above the cutoff, and were turned away without receiving an abortion. And we refer to this as the Turnaway group. The second group was also close to the cutoff, but they were below it, up to 2 weeks below it in terms of gestational age, and they received the abortion that they were seeking. So we link participants in this study to 10 years of credit reporting agency data, which gives credit report information on financial outcomes both several years before and several years after the pregnancy. For our analysis, we look at the trajectories of the financial outcomes for women in the Turnaway group and compare them to those same trajectories for women in the near limit group. And this type of statistical analysis in economics is called a difference in differences design, because we look at the difference in the trajectories over time. So we use this longitudinal data that has data from prior to the pregnancy to look at whether or not these groups were on similar trends before the pregnancy, and then see if they diverged around the time the near limit group received an abortion or the Turnaway group was turned away. One advantage of this approach is that we use individual fixed effects. So this accounts for any differences in individual characteristics across the two groups that don't vary over time. So that would include things like socioeconomic characteristics or demographics. So we're going to take those into account in our study, and the remaining variation we observe should be due to the abortion denial or the abortion receipt. Our data for the outcome variables come from one of the three major credit reporting agencies. These data have basically a snapshot of your credit report, which would include anything like unpaid bills, the debt that you might have, or your credit score. So we see 10 years of this snapshot, and we're able to sort of follow the women both forward and backwards in time. We were able to link a similar percent of the Turnaway group and the near limit group to the credit reporting agency data, about 78.8% in the Turnaway group and 78.4% in the near limit group. So our match rates were very similar across these two groups. It's also important to note that we did this match in a double-blind way, which prevented the credit reporting agency from knowing the identities of the women who were actually in the study. So they didn't know who was actually part of the Turnaway study when doing this match in order to protect privacy. We further restrict our sample to those who had credit reports prior to the abortion encounter and who were at least 20 years old in the year that they gave birth, or that they would have given birth if they had obtained an abortion or, in the Turnaway group, miscarried. We group our outcomes into two broad categories. The first category is, you can think of them as sort of the bad outcomes. They're measuring financial distress or financial problems. And these include having debt that's past due, so it was due at least 30 days ago and you didn't pay it. The amount of debt that is being collected upon by third-party debt collectors, collection agencies. An indicator of whether or not the participant has a subprime credit score. It's a credit score below 600 out of a max of 850. And then also we include the number of public records on the credit report. These are any negative interactions with the courts that are related to your credit. So this would be something like a bankruptcy, a lien or a tax lien if you didn't pay your taxes, an eviction, or a judgment if you owed money and your creditor took you to court. So these public records represent pretty serious adverse financial outcomes. Then the second group, we tried to come up with outcomes that we could think of as good outcomes that were sort of indicators of financial resiliency or financial independence. And in that category, we looked at the amount of credit that was available on your credit cards. So if you had a $5,000 limit and you were only spending $1,000, you had $4,000 available. That is a measure of sort of the buffer that you have in case you have to cover an unexpected expense. We had an indicator variable that the woman had any mortgage in her name, an indicator that she had a prime credit score, so a high credit score, and then the credit score itself. We looked at each of these outcomes individually, and then in the two groups, we also collapsed the outcomes into a single index that measures sort of the average effect among this entire group of outcomes. And we did that by dividing by the standard deviation of the outcome in the near limit group and subtracting off the mean. So it's measured in standard deviations. And this allows us to look at sort of all of these outcomes grouped together, and then we can break it down and look at each component separately. So this figure, I think, summarizes in some ways the findings of the paper. So here I have on the y-axis this financial distress index. Again, remember, these are the sort of negative financial characteristics like having unpaid bills, and we've grouped them together into a single index. Higher values indicate more financial problems and more financial stress. Now we've plotted this against time, where time 0 is the year when the women in the Turnaway group gave birth, if they did end up giving birth, or would have given birth if they had a miscarriage or had an abortion, and the year in which the near limit group would have given birth if they hadn't had an abortion, assuming a 40-week-long pregnancy. So what you can see is that prior to the birth year, the near limits are in this blue line and they're marked with triangles, and the Turnaway group is in the green line with circles. And you can see prior to the birth year, they actually look pretty similar. Not only are they at similar levels, but they also kind of are following the same trend. They're kind of right on top of each other. But beginning in the year of the birth, we start to see some divergence, with financial problems going up in the Turnaway group and essentially staying flat in the near limit group. They keep kind of going up, and they peak around the second year after the birth year. And then the financial problems seem to go back down a bit, but they don't ever totally close the gap by the end of the period, which is 5 years after the birth year, with the near limit group. Right. Looking at the credit access index, remember these are kind of the good outcomes. We see that they're not quite on top of each other, but they're on similar trajectories prior to the birth. And then we see divergence with a sort of decrease in access among the Turnaway group, with the near limit group remaining flat and then increasing. But in contrast to what we saw with the financial distress index, we do see that there is some catch up that happens by the third year after the birth year. So it's a little bit of a different pattern there. Here's very similar information, but this is with confidence intervals that can tell us whether these differences are actually statistically significant and statistically meaningful. And what I've plotted here is the difference in the trajectories and the 95% confidence intervals. And so what you can see is that, again, as we saw in the previous couple pictures, prior to the birth, the near limit group and the Turnaway group were not having statistically different trends, but then there is statistically different divergence starting in the year of the birth for the Turnaway group. And on average, it's about 1/10 of a standard deviation increase in financial problems. For the credit access index, again, this is just mirroring the raw data that I plotted for you. We see maybe some suggestive evidence of a decrease in credit access, but it is not statistically significant. So we cannot say from a statistical perspective that there was a different trend among the Turnaway group for this outcome. So this table shows the overall index, which I've already shown you, and then the 4 components of the index. And what we see is that in particular, we find statistically significant increases in the number of public records. Remember, those are those negative court records, things like bankruptcies, liens, and judgments. It increases by about 0.065 additional public records. It's about an 80% increase based on the pre-Turnaway mean. And we also see an increase in the amount of debt 30 days or more past due of about $1,700. That's also about an 80% increase in the amount past due relative to the pre-Turnaway mean. So we find significant increases in financial distress on these measures. For the credit access index, we didn't find a statistically significant change in the index overall, and we also don't find statistically significant changes for any of these individual components of having a prime credit score, having a mortgage, having available credit, or your credit score itself. One question you might have is, so we've documented that there are these large differences, 80% increase in public records and 80% increase in amount past due. One question you might have is this effect quite different from what a typical woman might experience after giving birth when faced with reduced income and more household expenses? Or is there sort of an additional penalty for the women in the Turnaway group because this birth resulted from the denial of an abortion? So we explore that looking at subsequent births that occur to women in the near limit group, women who obtained an abortion, but then later during the sample period went on to have a birth. So we do a sort of similar analysis for the subsequent birth in the near limit group and compare those results to what we see in the Turnaway group. And this figure shows the results of that analysis. So the blue dotted line is the effects that we're documenting in the near limit group. And what you can see is it does appear that they have some elevated rates of financial distress. Here on the y-axis is the effects for the financial distress index in year 1 and 2, but they're not statistically significant. And they're also quite a bit smaller than what is appearing in the Turnaway group. So this suggests to us that there may be some negative effects in the near limit group in subsequent births, but they appear to be smaller than what the Turnaway group experienced. This is a similar figure, but plotting the credit access index for the two groups. Again, we didn't really find much statistically significant changed in the credit access group for the Turnaway, but here we see that the effects do appear to be larger and more negative in the Turnaway group, whereas they're essentially completely flat in the near limit group. So to conclude, what we find is that women who are denied abortions suffer adverse financial consequences as a result. The effects are large, increasing rates of delinquency and the rates of fairly serious negative financial events by about 80%. And they're also fairly persistent. They're present beginning the year of the birth, and they persist essentially throughout our entire sample period. We also provide some suggestive analysis that this sort of financial hardship is larger among the Turnaway group than it might be following a typical pregnancy, or at least might be following a pregnancy that the near limit group experienced. Thanks for watching. If you are interested in this, I'd really encourage you to check out the paper where we have a lot of additional analyses. Otherwise, I will just conclude and direct you to that. Thank you.